Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. I'm Jonah Newman. I'm the managing editor of Injustice Watch. Bea, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Bea. I'm a software engineer for this project. Otherwise, I'm a software engineer at the New York Times. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so we are here to talk about the Check Your Judges judicial election guide. So I will jump right in and get started. Everyone see, there we go. To get started, so a little bit about ourselves. So Injustice Watch is a Chicago-based nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism organization that focuses on issues of equity and justice in the courts, especially the Circuit Court of Cook County. Sorry about my dog. And so since our founding a little over 6 years ago, we've been really focused on the judiciary and the impact that judges can have on people's lives. Judicial elections can seem obscure and it's really hard to find information about them. But judges are the elected officials that you're most likely to encounter, the ones who whose decisions can really most directly impact your life. Obviously, policy decisions that that governors and state legislators make certainly, are also impactful in lots of ways. But on a very deeply personal way, right? Like if you are filing for divorce, if you are dealing with a child custody battle, or obviously facing a criminal charge, even like settling a loved one's estate, right? A judge is going to be involved in that decision. And then once a judge is elected, they're very rarely removed from office. We can talk about that a little more, but judges are, in the last 30 or so years in Cook County, only 2 sitting judges have ever been removed from the bench. So the problem is that there's all these candidates and very little information and places to get information about them. And as a result, a lot of voters have historically skipped this part of the ballot, or made decisions about who to vote for based solely on things like gender or assumptions they make about ethnicity. So we are trying to fill that gap, that information gap, with our judicial election guide. So our approach is to educate voters about the importance of judicial elections, like we're doing right now in the months leading up to the election, develop a user-friendly judicial election guide, build an engagement campaign around judicial elections. That's the hashtag Check Your Judges, trying to make sure that people are paying attention to these races, and then making sure that our work is accessible, community driven, and gets in front of as many people as possible. A little bit about our guides, and I'll put up a link in a second. So our guides are nonpartisan. We don't make endorsements or recommendations. We do months of extensive research and reporting about each judge on the ballot, including detailed information about their work history, their legal experience, community involvement. We actually, did some work, and I'll talk about this in a second, to get community feedback this time around, especially from people most impacted by the court system, about what information they wanted to know, what they thought people wanted to know most about judicial candidates. We include campaign finance data, and Bea is going to talk about that in a little bit. Responses to Injustice Watch's candidate survey, and ratings from the bar associations, which are groups of attorneys that evaluate candidates and put out ratings each election cycle. So 2022, so this year we created 2 election guides, one for the June primary election, where there were 75 candidates who were vying for 29 open seats on the court, most of them in Democratic primaries. Obviously, we're in Cook County, so most of the judges who won their Democratic primaries are now running unopposed for those seats in the general election. So then we created a whole new guide for next month's general election, where in addition to those vacant seats, there are also 61 current Cook County judges who are running for another term on the bench. And in addition to our digital guide, which we'll talk more about, we also printed more than 120,000 copies. Actually, that should be even higher. We just had to do a second print run, so I think it's now almost 130,000 copies of the guide this fall. and we're distributing them across the city and Cook County with the specific goal of reaching people without internet access or low digital literacy, including both in the primary and in the general election, distributing 4,000 copies of the guides to voters in the Cook County Jail to ensure that folks there who are eligible to vote can use our guide and have information to vote for. So here's where you can go to follow along in justicewatch.org/judges, or you can scan the QR code. I'll give you a second if you want to do that before I keep going. Great, so this is what you'll see. So on the left is sort of our intro page, which again kind of talks through some of what I just talked about, explains why judicial elections are important, and talks a little bit about sort of what you're going to see on your ballot in Cook County. So again, this time around, we focus on judges running for what's called retention. In Illinois, once a judge is elected to a seat, if they're at the circuit court level, they serve a 6-year term. Appellate and Supreme Court judges serve 10-year terms. And at the end of that term, if they want to keep their jobs, they need to run for what's called retention, which is just an up or down vote. They don't have challengers. You're just going to be asked yes or no on each judge. And judges need at least 60% yes votes in order to stay in office. Historically, judges get on average between 70 and 80%, depending on whether they've gotten good bar association ratings, positive press, endorsements from the major newspapers, things like that. So that 60% threshold seems pretty high, but actually it's been, like I said, historically very difficult for a judge not to meet that threshold and stay in office. So how do we put together this guide? Let me first talk about the research, and then Bea will talk a little bit about the tech and how the site's actually built. So we have a small but mighty team of reporters and researchers who have spent months, like I said, researching the candidates. And we do that through public records research, through news clips, looking at campaign finance information, right, which is publicly available data. We look at economic disclosure forms that each judge has to file with the Illinois Supreme Court, which is, again, technically publicly available, but they make it very difficult. You actually have to file a separate paper form to request each judge's individual economic disclosure, which they then, the Supreme Court then sends a copy. It's like on that like old school triplicate paper, and they give a copy of the handwritten form to the judge, so they know who's been requesting their economic disclosure form. So we do that. We look through candidates, through judges, like history of reversal. So have they ever been reversed by the Illinois Appellate Court? Have their decisions been overturned, and how often and in what circumstances? We sent every candidate or every judge a survey asking them about their upbringing, their experience. This year, we specifically wanted to know sort of how they've grappled with or thought about the power that judges hold over people's lives and the decisions they make. And then we put all of that together. Oh, one more thing. So we did outreach to community organizations. We created an advisory board, like I talked about earlier, that included people who have been personally affected by the criminal legal system to ask them what information they thought we should include in the guide. And we incorporated that. So one of the things we added this year that we haven't done in the past was we asked judges to tell us about their community involvement, because people told us that mattered to them, right? How involved are you in your community? What kind of volunteer work have you done? What kinds of things have you done, outside of the courtroom to make a difference? And then earlier this year, we also partnered with WBEZ's Curious City podcast to ask listeners for their questions about judicial elections. And the slide got cut off or didn't get finished, but and we did an episode talking about the importance of judicial elections as well. So with that, I will turn things over to Bea.
Cool. Thanks, Jonah. Yeah, I'll just briefly, because this is Shy Hack Night, talk about the technology for the site. So this year's guides are building on the 2020 election guides built by Mark LaJoy. So we're building on top of his existing React front end, and we're using React Redux for global state storage. He originally built it with a different CMS, but we decided at the beginning of 2022 to move it over to an Airtable backend. That was a tool that and Justice Watch was already using for their research management, and that I really like as a lightweight backend for like a site that has relatively a small amount of data you'll be pulling in. And I was pretty happy with it. They have some cool features like built-in rich text support for text fields and photo attachments. And it was useful that they have the concept of foreign key linking, unlike Google Sheets or something like that. So it's kind of a nice midpoint between Google Sheets and like a full-blown CMS that I think worked pretty well for us. It meant that the editing and the data importing could be happening in the same place. And going in from past analytics, we knew this should be a mobile-first site and wanted to design it so that someone could be using it on their desktop as they were preparing to go to vote, but also could potentially like have it on their phone and looking at it in the voting booth. So we wanted something visually that was simple and straightforward, and someone could be looking through 75 options as they're filling out their ballot. We also wanted visually it to look reasonably close to the actual ballot so that there could be a translation there. Go on to the next slide, please. One feature that I think is really, I guess I'm going to talk through a couple of specific features that I think are worth highlighting. So the site, the suggested flows you go through and you're looking at each candidate bio and selecting how you want to vote on them. And at the end, you have the option of printing it out as a report. And I think that's an example of us really trying to meet people where they're at. But this is not every website needs to be printed necessarily, but this is one that has a really concrete use of people having a lot of information and then producing something small and able to bring to the voting booth. This was one of the most technically finicky parts of the site that Mark had done a lot to do in 2020. We used React PDF renderer. It would recommend, because I think it's a really valuable thing to have, but definitely taking a site and data and translating that to a PDF and having that work across all browsers was a finicky piece of the technology. Go on. Something else I wanted to highlight is that the guide is completely translated into Spanish as well as English. And this is something that upped the complexity of the development, but I think was incredibly worthwhile because a lot of voters in Cook County are Spanish speakers. And there's a lot of information here about the judges that isn't available anywhere else, including in this guide. All of their survey responses were translated into Spanish. The way that we did this was kind of a hand-rolled solution, but we have basically we have like a translation strings tab in Airtable that's for the smaller things, like the text here that's saying, click here to see the glossary terms. For the check your judges text would be individual lines, and then for the longer things like this judicial experience block, we have mirrored text, mirrored columns for each language. So definitely something, whenever we added something, we had to think through how to do it in both English and Spanish. But the fact that from the beginning going in, we knew that this was important was a big part of the development. I also wanted to highlight a feature, the pop-up glossary terms here. This is the Chancery Division, the English translation of what's showing up that Jonah proposed the cycle that I think is really great. Means that as you're reading, you can see what there's a lot of judicial, a lot of court jargon, and I think it's really helpful to have as you're reading through, like, what does this division mean? Like, how are judges appointed? Things like that. So I would encourage you, the darker orange terms, to click on as you're going through. I put this on the accessibility slide here because this was one of the trickier things to make sure it was accessible. And something I wanted to highlight in this project was that we had a screen reader tester. Andrew Webb was super helpful, and I appreciate Jenna kind of coming in and having that already set up. I think as a software engineer, I can be careful about using semantic HTML and thinking it through and testing it myself in VoiceOver, but it was incredibly useful to then be able to hand it to someone who uses a screen reader regularly and say, like, hey, can you click through here and tell me what it looks like? And that was part of the process I would definitely recommend to anyone else setting up a similar project.
Totally. I'll just add one thing quickly about the Spanish, which is, there were still also things like we didn't totally think about, right? Which is that, like, obviously Spanish, unlike English, like, has different nouns for different genders. And so that was something that, like, we're actually still, finalizing and figuring out. So, like, this Mary Jane Tice should say that she's an ex defensora publica, right? because that's the feminine version. So, those are things that I think we're still also learning and iterating on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Watch for that correctly gendered translation in the next few days. This last slide, so this is from the primary guide. We don't have any campaign finance data analysis up for the current race or the current elections because it's kind of just starting to come in, but we're planning on it. This is from the primary, but for that election, we decided to pull in data from the Illinois State Board of Election to look at the individual donation receipts for each candidate. I thought this was really interesting. It also let us kind of start pulling out patterns. It's also some interesting just one-off stories. This is showing a judicial candidate accepting a donation from the FOP, $5,000. The way that I did this was it was very helpful to look at Illinois Sunshine's way of dealing with this data. So shout out to Illinois Sunshine. And we have a separate repository that has a Python script that I scheduled to run every day through a GitHub action, and that processes a gigantic text file from the Illinois State Board of Elections that, fun fact, their receipts text file has every donation receipt from 1994. So the first thing that I'm doing, it's a makefile that does a couple of things and runs a Python script. But before feeding it to the Python script, we just lop off the first 5 million records that gets us like in the 2020s. And then we aggregated the top donors and we were checking that every day. And we found that we ended up getting things on the site faster than other accessible ways to see where campaign finance contributions were going in the race. And I think that's it for tech.
Great, yeah. So just again wanted to highlight that one of the important things about this project that we did this year in particular was to try to make sure that it's accessible to people who don't have digital access, don't have internet access, or maybe aren't as digitally literate. So we printed copies of our guide and partnered with and let me see if this is, so we distributed 4,000 guides to voters in the Cook County Jail. Like I mentioned, we partnered with more than 80 community organizations, churches, libraries, local businesses. I think that number has probably gone up now to distribute print copies throughout Chicago and suburban Cook County. We also partnered with some existing community newspapers and other print papers. So, you can find our guide in this week's Chicago Reader, Southside Weekly, Hyde Park Herald, as well as the Austin Weekly News and some of the other suburban, West suburban newspapers. And on top of that, we've this year, or for this election, we distributed them to libraries all over the city, and again, partnered with community organizations. This picture is, this is the Reverend Robin Hood, and he and his church and organization, nonprofit that he runs, helped distribute 10,000 guides on the west side of Chicago this year. Just this election, I think it was 5,000 in the last election. So again, wanting to prioritize communities most impacted by the justice system and by the courts. So I think that's our last slide. Happy to answer questions now, and I'd love to talk more about how this works. Go back up to that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was really interesting. To say that this was a lot of work is an understatement. This is a huge project. We definitely have a lot of audience questions. I don't know if just for the sake of the YouTube, if you mind stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
Awesome. I think that way we can just kind of see everybody. Thank you. Let me get to some audience questions. So how is the Spanish translation generated, and what was the language review process like for that?
Yeah, so I can start. So we worked with some freelance translators, and sort of in stages over the course, as we had different parts of the content ready, we sent it to them to translate, and then they sent it back to us, and we added it into the Airtable backend that Bea was describing. I am not, I mean, I took high school Spanish, but I'm not fluent in Spanish. And so we had some members of our team who are, look over it. We also had the translators themselves then look back over the site once the content was up there, and they, gave us some additional feedback, like some of the things about, gender differences that obviously they didn't see when they were just looking at the text, but then once it was in context of the actual website, recognized needed to be tweaked. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one. Are you aware of similar guides for other jurisdictions or key differences between how like Illinois Cook County elect judges versus other places?
Great question. So I am not aware of other judicial election guides out there. I do think, and I don't know like off the top of my head exactly. I know there's some resources out there about how different states do judges. I know, a lot of states have like merit selection of judges, similar to like the federal system where judges are appointed by, the governor, maybe based on the recommendations of a state commission of appointed officials, things like that. So we are like, I think, relatively rare in the way that we do elections. There are, I should say, some Cook County judges who are not elected by the public, but are actually elected by other judges. So there's about 400 circuit judges in Cook County, circuit court judges in Cook County. I think about 2/3 of those are elected, and about 1/3 are known as associate judges. They have all the same roles and responsibilities, but they're elected by the elected judges. So it's this sort of convoluted two-layered system. And those judges, again, have the same roles and responsibilities, but will never appear on a public ballot and they have to run for re-election by the other judges, but they don't have to run for public election.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. There's a lot of information there. Awesome. Have you collaborated with other election info sources, such as like Ballot Ready?
That's a good question. We have not. It's, I think, something like, again, kind of, unique that we're doing here in Cook County. We've definitely been approached by folks in other places who are interested in how we did it and, trying to maybe replicate in other places. And I'm hoping in a non-election year, maybe 2023 is the year, when I have a little bit of a break, that we can put together a little bit of kind of a how-to guide that we might be able to share and help other people create something similar. But yeah, we haven't done that yet.
Yeah, and I apologize if you mentioned this. This is like your second iteration of this project, right?
It's really our so I'd say the first sort of full iteration was 2018, was the 2018 election cycle, I think. The like November 2016 election, there was like a very, very brief sort of here are the judges on your ballot. So maybe that was the like, first round, but then there was, we did full guides but for both the primary and general elections in 2018, 2020, and now 2022.
Awesome. Okay. So it's almost like you're kind of like perfecting for Cook County, which is an insane amount of data alone, right? So kind of piggybacking into that a little bit, like, is there any interest from this group or like maybe tag teaming with another group to like try to expand this work beyond Cook County? And if there was, what do you think it would take to expand this work?
Yeah, that is something, we kind of think about and get asked all the time. Yeah, I mean, I would love to expand, even just to like the collar counties, right? Like, let's start small and like, Lake County, DuPage. I think like there's lots of, a lot fewer judges there than in Cook County, but still quite a few judges, and there's still, so yeah, I mean, I think that's something we would love to do. I think it would take resources and just more people. We're a small nonprofit with like right now fewer than 10 total full-time employees. So I think it would take a lot more a lot more people to be able to do the research and really build the, because that is the most time consuming part, is just gathering all that information and then building it.
For sure. Yeah. And then kind of another question related to that. So, because as you said, it was a lot of work to go through all of this research. It feels quite monumental. So like what was that process like for your research leads? And like, I think more importantly, like what were their general milestones along the way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we had, again, because as we've been kind of perfecting this, we do have kind of a checklist of like, okay, here for each judge, like here are the things we want to review, right? Like we're going to look at, have they been sued before? We're going to look, and like what happened there. We're going to look at, again, like for sitting judges, like have their decisions been reversed? Have they ever been disciplined by like the state bodies that, deal with attorney or judge misconduct? So kind of going through, and looking at all the news clips, can we see like from news stories, like what kinds of cases have they worked on, or what kinds of, decisions have they made? So we sort of go through that checklist, and then there's, sort of a review process, and then we go through the process of writing out the profiles, and there's another editing process there. So there's sort of, different milestones along the way. But mostly it was just sort of like from the beginning, okay, here's how many people we have on our team, here's how many judges we have to do, like let's divide and conquer and sort of figure out how many people each judge, how many judges each person has to research. And that's kind of where we started.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. When I was going through the website, I noticed, I think what I was just kind of struck by, maybe this was easy, maybe it wasn't, but for like the ratings section, right, where it's like, here's what each legal association that we have the data for is said about so-and-so, right? So like, what was that? Was getting access to that kind of data difficult? It sounds like a lot of this stuff was like maybe publicly available, but not the most accessible because they're just like buried in PDFs, right? But what was that process like of like interacting with all these different legal associations?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, and then Bea can talk about sort of how we decided to design that part of the site. So so there's 13 bar associations in Chicago and Cook County that rate Cook County judicial candidates. And there's sort of varying degrees of information, but basically, they do put out their ratings, and they actually have their own website where you can find the ratings from 12 of the bar associations. But mostly like they send it in a PDF, and it's like a big PDF table that has like the ratings for each of the of these bar associations. And so we had to hand enter that into Airtable to make it work for us. But I think a big part of that was figuring out like how do we make it accessible and readable. In the past, actually, like this was 2022 was the first year that we included the ratings from all 13 of the bar associations. In past years, we had picked, there's three bar associations that in the past have given sort of a reason for their ratings. They give like a little write-up. And so in the past, we'd only included those because then we could also include sort of the reasons that they gave for why they rated someone positively or negatively. Because we do want to be sort of a one-stop shop for people, and there are people who want to know what all the bar associations think. So we decided to include those, all 13. But Bea, I think, did a great job figuring out how to make that clear and easy to read and scannable. I love the little gauge at the top that kind of tells you, gives you at one glance, like, did this person get mostly positive ratings? Did they get all negative ratings? Was it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I know when we were first starting to look at ratings, I had a lot of questions for Jonah about like, does this association just say everyone is fine? Like, is a positive rating? How much does it matter from each of these? And that's something that we tried to convey. And like he was saying, we have the 13 ratings, and we have those color coded, but then we also have this gauge that's kind of like the gas tank full meter. And let that be a little more those numbers calculated by Injustice Watch staff. So we had some space to be like, it's actually really unusual. This association gave this person not qualified, and then we had a little excerpt next to all of them for a place to kind of synthesize all of that information. So we wanted to present all of the ratings, but also give like an umbrella synthesis of what those actually mean.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny too, because it's like to me, like just saying, oh, this association just said yes to this person. Like, I don't like what's the threshold between yes and no? But so just having all of that in one place is super helpful.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we have a story coming out about this probably next week, and some of the sort of criticisms and shortcomings of the bar rating system. You'll see in our guide this year, like out of the 61 judges, only 4 of them got any negative ratings at all, and one of them it's because she was too late to participate in the process. So yeah, it is pretty rare actually for sitting judges to be rated not qualified at all. And so yeah, kind of thinking through that, and it also, like we said, was really important to us to include a summary of those blurbs that some of the bar associations give to sort of explain their ratings, so we could give people that additional context too.
Awesome. I'm going to kind of pivot back to some audience questions in a moment. But given that this work is all like nonpartisan, how are y'all tracking success or like outcomes from this type of work? Like, what is the obviously the website's like really awesome to look at, right? But like, what were your kind of like internal success metrics? So at the end of the project, you're like, yes, we did a really good job,
Yeah, I think, number of people reached obviously is one of them. I think, between the digital guide and the print guide in the primary, and obviously the voter turnout was very low this primary election. Seems like it's maybe on track to be more hot, normal for a midterm in November. But yeah, I mean, I think something like half of all people who voted in a judicial race in Cook County had access to our guide, or by the numbers, right? Obviously, we don't know exact people, but like that's how many users and print guides we got out there. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing that we've tracked, and I'm not going to take full credit for this, but is that participation in the judicial portion of the ballot has been increasing over the last 6 or 8 years, since Injustice Watch was founded. And I think we have played a role in that. I think there's community groups that have also played a big role in kind of stressing the importance of these elections. The last couple year election cycles, there have been campaigns, really focused on one specific judge and getting them kicked off the ballot or kicked off the bench. But so I think there's been a lot of factors, but I do think having a news organization in town that's really focused on this, that's telling people that it's important. So we're seeing that participation rate go up, and I think we see that as a success.
Awesome. Do you have any analytics on how often the site is accessed in Spanish versus English? And have you ever, is there like a dedicated Spanish language outreach with this as well?
Yeah, great question. So I will say we have not done a great job at least from the previous iterations of the site. So the first time we translated it was November 2020, and then again in June 2022, and again this year. And I would say the first 2 Spanish guides we did not get a ton of views. We're working to improve on that this time around, and in a few ways. So one is we partnered with La Raza, which is a Spanish language newspaper, and put a couple of ads in their paper with links to the site, and also worked with them to write an article sort of about the importance of judicial elections and about the guide to send to get it in front of people that way. And we're also partnering with kind of more organizations that reach Spanish speaking communities in Chicago. So there's a few like Immigration or Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights is going to be distributing copies of our print guide this year, and some other organizations. And then we also partnered with, there's a small nonprofit newsroom called Cicero Independiente, which is focused on Cicero. They're a bilingual news organization, so they publish in both English and Spanish, and they are also printing our guide this year. So we're trying to do more outreach, but it's definitely a place we'd love to see improvement in also, and would love to partner with more folks who have connections and have outreach in those communities too. Yeah,
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? It's like more power in numbers, so the more orgs supporting that work too is just going to be helpful. So that's great. That's awesome to hear that you're kind of tapping into some of the other community organizations going on. Awesome. Let's get to another question. Referring back to like the screen reader user testing, was there any like surprising feedback around the screen reader regarding accessibility at all?
That's a good question. I would say every round we did was definitely like an educational experience for me. Like it was usually a list of fairly like nitty gritty details, but each like there are a couple that were like, oh, I forgot to make something that should be a headline, like an H1 element, so that the screener would read it as a headline, and just being extremely consistent with that kind of thing. I'd say there were a category of accessibility bugs that were like about the way that elements were ordered on the page. So visually they made sense, but the way that the elements were actually showing up, like the ordering of that wasn't the way that made sense to a screen reader. So like having the checkboxes before the names instead of after the names, where visually they showed up after, but the way that the CSS was written meant that they were showing up before, things like that. Yeah, I would say like, real consistency with setting prior controls and alt text and things like that. Things that are a little bit hacky and make sense visually, like in check your judges, like dropping the space between the last two words is right for visuals, but it's not right for a screen reader. So I'd say a lot of like consistent attention to detail is really the thing that testing process like pushed me to do, and also was a reminder that just learning to develop web applications in an accessible way just takes a lot of like repeated attention to that detail. Nothing like hugely surprising, I wouldn't say, but just like attention to small details is important.
So earlier on you mentioned like kind of going through the process of like getting feedback about like what information do you want to see on this guide, right? Like what was that process like for y'all to just get more community feedback of like, this is how this can be super helpful for me?
Yeah, so I think, again, sort of the two main ways we did that is we sort of convened a hand-picked kind of advisory board of people from, again, different community organizations around Chicago and Cook County. We tried to specifically focus on and include people who have been incarcerated or have been involved in the justice system in some way, and talk to them about like, how have you used the guide in the past? What have you liked about it? What haven't you liked? What kinds of things do you want to see that we don't already have? And then the other piece was partnering with WBEZ's Curious City, which for anyone who doesn't know, like it's a kind of program where they solicit questions from listeners and then use those questions to sort of put on a radio show and podcast, and also put out other content and information. And so we asked people like, what are your questions about judicial elections? And use some of that to help also inform not just like some of the stories we've done, but also the guide itself about like what's the baseline information people need or are wondering about, that we can include and sort of put up top. So that's, some of what you'll find in that top kind of introductory paragraph is, comes from that. And, and again, that's also been some of the like reporting we've done around, the questions people have, like, why are people running for judge as Democrats and Republicans when they first run for the bench? Like, aren't judges supposed to be non-biased, right? So like, and trying to answer those questions and, based on the system that we have.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe like two more audience questions. You've been doing a great job answering all of these that I've been lobbing at you. So thank you. So yes, here's just like a little, just kind of like factual information if you can provide it. What happens if a judge fails the retention vote? How is that vacancy filled? Great question. So in Illinois, anytime there's a vacancy, so whether it's because a judge retires, is kicked out of office, for misconduct, which really rarely happens, resigns, et cetera, the Illinois Supreme Court fills that vacancy until the next election. So if someone does not
meet that 60% threshold and doesn't win retention, the terms end like December 7th or something, the first week in December. But the Illinois Supreme Court at any point can fill that vacancy until the, in this case, it would be until the 2024 primary election.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And then I think one final one. If you were starting over again with this tech, right, how it's built, are there different tools or frameworks you would choose instead? Or like whenever you do your next iteration of this, like have any sense into what improvements or changes you might make?
Yeah, I can start answering that. I saw that one in the chat. Thanks, Michael. I was thinking about it. Always a good question. I would say that for the 2020 election cycle, I was coming into it and Mark had already done a great job with the 2020 cycle, and we decided to use his project as a base, which we decided to do, I think because he did a really solid job with it. Like we definitely didn't have to, and like I very much wanted to stick with his stack and not be reinventing the wheel. I'd say the biggest change that we made was switching CMSs from, I think, Contentful, correct me if I was wrong, Jonah, to Airtable, which I think it was the right decision. I do really like working with Airtable, and I think it was a closer coupling of the research and the editing and the pulling in the data process. It also meant that before the translation strings had been just like a static file, and it meant that they could also live in Airtable and just gave us a lot more flexibility. But definitely means that, the site was engineered to be pulling in contentful data and then had to kind of move it over to Airtable. So I guess my answer would be to not switch CMSs halfway through a project is part of the answer. I don't know, it has a hand-rolled, like we made our own translation system, and we could probably have used a React package for that of some kind. Mark had already done that work and it was working well, so I didn't investigate that. If I was doing it from like a greenfield project, I probably could have evaluated available options before doing it myself. But yeah, overall, if I were doing this project again from scratch, I would probably like the basics, Redux and Node and Airtable. I would probably stick with that stack, honestly. Be curious to hear Jonah's perspective on that too.
Yeah, no, I think actually, I mean, for me as the person doing the editing and kind of dealing with the content mostly, Airtable was a lot easier and kind of more straightforward than Contentful, and also easier, like you said, because we were already working in Airtable to kind of keep track of our research progress. It was made life easier that way. I think, there's definitely probably ways we could clean up and simplify the translation part of things. I think there's we sort of kept adding terms to that translations lookup table without ever taking any off. So it's probably kind of there's probably some text in there that we're not actually using on the site, but that's just still living in there, that, those things like that I think we could clean up. But in terms of the overall tech, I think, I'm really happy with it.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Very pro Airtable. That's which I'm glad to hear. Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for now. Thank you so much. This was really insightful. This work was really powerful. So thank you not only just for the work that you did, but thanks for coming to share it at Chat Hack Night.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, and definitely encouraging everyone to go out there, check your judges, tell your friends, have them check their judges too. They're really important races. So awesome.
Bea, any last words?
No, just thanks so much for having us. Would encourage everyone to use the guide. If you see any bugs, it's probably my fault and you can contact me.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you to our speakers. I have to do this last little dorky thing at the end. So, all right, everybody. Oh yeah. Thank you, Josh. Real winner today is Josh. Thank you for reminding me to say this. So, at around 8 p.m. pretty soon, we'll have the post-presentation Zoom. And it's at that link there. Again, if you're not sure If you don't want to remember that link, it is in the Slack channel, on the Chai Hack Night remote Slack channel. So go check out Slack, slackme.chaihacknight.org. That would be slackme.chaihacknight.org. That's the best way to join. So now I'll do that big dorky thing that we got to do. But go forth and hack.